story about 4 people who disappeared. They were not assassinated, they were not murdered, they were not suicided, but their careers ended basically at the height of their careers. The first one is Dorothy Thompson. A movie was made about her. I don't recall the name of the movie, but Katharine Hepburn played her, and she was second only to Eleanor Roosevelt in terms of popularity of female figures in the late 1930s, 1940s. She was an endorser of Zionism and reporter on what the people were being told about the Holocaust. And then she made a mistake. After World War II, she actually went to Palestine. And what she saw there, I don't know if it was before or after the massacre at the Ir Yassin, which was a pivotal point. But Plan Dalet was designed to both terrorize and depopulate Palestine. And the Ir Yassin was a major part of that terror campaign. Dorothy Thompson came back and reported on her complete horror of what was taking place in Palestine. And from that point on, she dropped off the face of the earth. Not literally, but in terms of her career. There was not a door that was open, that was closed to her prior to that, including the door of the Oval Office. And there was not a door that was open to her after this. Zip. Absolutely nothing. The second person who disappeared, and who I am currently reading, is Douglas Reed, who was the international journalist in Europe. He's written a number of books, and I'm currently reading 2 of them. When he published Far and Wide, he became an unperson. And Far and Wide is an interpretation of the United States as it fits into the development and evolution of nation states. He learned a great deal about how power is manipulated by reporting on Europe in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And when he fit the evolution of the United States into that historical pattern of manipulation, he stepped on toes that don't like to be stepped on. So that when he got around to writing the book, The Controversy of Zion, which is a description of the kind of Judaism that is actually practiced and believed in by the ruling elites of Judaism. And that's, I'm making a very careful distinction there, because it is not the Judaism of the vast majority of American Jews. It probably is not the form of Judaism of a lot of European Jews. It is the Judaism that is observed, embraced, and enforced, crucial word, by the Jewish leadership of Eastern Europe and the Jewish elite of the world. He never expected and was confident that The Controversy of Zion would never be published in his lifetime, and basically settled into anonymity. He retired in South Africa knowing that nothing he was going to write would ever be published again in his lifetime, and he was right. Douglas Reed was brilliant, and I would encourage anything that he has written And much of what he has written is available in PDF format online for free. I would encourage you to Google or DuckDuckGo Douglas Reed and read what you can of him. But once he wrote Far and Wide, which put the evolution of the United States dominated by the power of the ruling elites, nothing else was going to be published. The third individual was not in journalism, but Friedman, Benjamin Friedman, was the owner of the Palmolive soap company in the 30s and 40s. He was delivered by the father of Louise Brandeis, and in the Jewish community of the early 20th century, put it that way, was an insider's insider. He was informed, I love your hat, he was informed about everything that was going on in the Jewish community in terms of manipulation of Woodrow Wilson, etc., etc. Something happened to totally disillusion Benjamin on the American Jewish community. And from that point on, he spent the vast majority of the Palmolive soap fortune exposing that form of Judaism of which he was vigorously opposed. It was he who gave us the information that Jewish American editors needed to be convinced that Lloyd George had promised Palestine to the Jews if the Jews could deliver American leadership into World War I. That meeting took place between the representative of, is it Douglas Lloyd George? Anyway, Lloyd George and the leadership of the American Jewish community took place in the most inconspicuous of ways. It took place on Christmas Day at a New York hotel. Can you get any more anonymous than that? I don't think so. Anyway, it is Benjamin Friedman who tells us how important Kol Nidrei is. Kol Nidrei is a prayer that every Jew, whether he or she is aware of its significance or not, prays at synagogue or temple on Yom Kippur. The prayer exonerates every Jew praying it from complying with any oath that that Jew is going to take for the coming year. For example, if you take it, I'm going to pick a month. If you take it in April, any oath you make for that April to the next April is null and void. You may make the oath, but you have no obligation whatsoever to keep it. It is basically an authority to lie before your God. Not to your God, but before your God, okay? That prayer has been discussed on numerous occasions by Jewish leadership and has never been annulled. The annulment has been discussed, but has never been annulled. And I have searched for some rational, pious reason for the inclusion. And if I stretch my nose out to approximately that wall, I could come up with a rationale for it. But it is really stretching language to make that accommodation. So it is basically, in my opinion, and definitely in Mr. Friedman's opinion, it is a get out of jail free for lying to your neighbor card. Okay? Benjamin Friedman became an unperson when he started attacking the American Jewish community. And if you go to Wikipedia, you will find that Benjamin Friedman is spoken of as a self-hating Jew. Dorothy Thompson as one who once had a brilliant career. I don't know if on the Wikipedia page the loss of her career is explained. The fourth person is Harry Elmer Barnes, who was an absolutely brilliant historian. He was the father of American historiography. His mistake was believing that you could write history honestly without taking account of the social dogmas of the day. It is said by people like Deborah Lipstadt that he was the father of Holocaust denial. That ain't so. He was among the historians who insisted on doing decent historiography on any subject that they're going to do historiography on. Ron Unz makes the comment about Miss Lipstadt that it is totally appropriate that her academic appointment is in the Department of Theology rather than the Department of History, because the way she treats history is the reporting of socially acceptable dogma. I wanted to call attention to these four unpersons because journalists today are fully aware, absolutely, completely aware, that to do good journalism today is a suicide note. To do good journalism today is a sure ticket to becoming an unperson. There's something incredibly ironic about that, because very recently the Washington Post, which has been a CIA instrument for decades, it was an instrument of the Washington Post when they reported on the Watergate break-ins, did a very good article on the war in Afghanistan. They spent hundreds of thousands of Jeff Bezos's dollars to force the American government to reveal documents that belonged to the American public by right under Freedom of Information Act. But the Washington Post had to take them to court in order to get access to the documents. Why did they take the United States government to court? Were they trying to do great journalism? No. They thought the information in those documents was going to be a hit, was going to be a fatal blow to the heart of the Trump presidency. And so they were willing to invest the money, and they were willing to invest a reporter's time in order to get them. And the reporters did a great job of reporting on it. You'll be able to read about it if you go to some of the alternative literature. It is a tragic commentary on our time that an outlet such as the Washington Post is willing to spend a great deal of money and a great deal of time and do great journalism. Will not take anything away from it, and do great journalism. Unfortunately, their goal was not to do great journalism. It was to do a hit piece on President Trump. Now, with that behind me, I want to introduce you to three people, really, and definitely endorse, actually I can endorse all three of them. The interviewer in the two films that I'm about to show you is Hanne Nabintu Herland. I hope some of you are already aware of her, but she is a journalist and interviewer who has done very good work in interviewing the right people at the right time. Today she is interviewing Senator Black from Virginia. And she is interviewing Phil Giraldi, a former CIA agent and very intelligent gentleman. I find the two interviews an astonishing contrast. Senator Black is quite intelligent. He served as a pilot in Vietnam, and after his Vietnam duty, sought a career in politics, was elected senator. I don't know what his early political relationship was, but he eventually became a senator from Virginia as a Republican. If I were to lay money on it, I would put a substantial amount of money on saying that Senator Black believes that Lee Harvey Oswald shot President John F. Kennedy. I would likewise put money on the assertion that Senator Black believes that 19 Arabs attacked the United States on September 11th of 2001. Now, I fully affirm to you that I think he's quite intelligent. And yet, most, if not all, of the people in this room know that he's wrong on those two very simple points. He's an insider who cannot see the forest because he's lived among the trees so long. So I want you to listen to the interview with that awareness that it is not a matter of his intelligence. It is a matter of what avenues are intrinsically closed off to him because of being the kind of insider that he is. Phil Giraldi is a former CIA agent. Most of his writing recently has been about the influence of the Jewish influence in American politics. And when we say Jewish influence, I almost want to say Zionist influence, but that would be, to say it Zionist is too narrow and to say Jewish is too broad, so I don't know how to compromise. But what Giraldi has to share with us is an insight into how the inside works that is totally lacking in Senator Black's understanding. I'm going to play these in succession and ask questions if you will, but I'm not going to interrupt the films. If you have questions or comments, save them till the end of either the first film or the second film, please.
There was this very dark, sinister cabal of individuals who began to emerge with Herbert Walker Bush. One of the major things Herbert Walker Bush did, the Republican Party had been the party of peace up until that time. It was the Democrats who took us to war, the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and then all of a sudden, Herbert Walker Bush, who had been the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, not much difference than being the head of the KGB, same type of thing, he flipped it. He said, oh, you know, we now have this three-legged stool where, you know, one of the legs of conservatism is basically war. And then his son carried it on. And the Democrats, which had always been a war organization, except during the Vietnam where some of their base rose up because they were threatened with the draft. Other than that, they've always been the force of war. So now you have the Democrats who favor war and the Republicans who favor war. There is no peace party any longer. And this is a great tragedy.
It's such an honor to have you as a guest, Senator Richard Black, on the Herland Report. You have an amazing track record and a career as a military colonel, then as a pilot in the US Marines in Vietnam. Then you retired from the military and from various positions in the Pentagon in 1994. Then you embarked on a political career, and you have become one of the most renowned and well-respected men in the United States as a senator, with a broad understanding and a remarkable knowledge on how the world works outside of the US, and an understanding that has earned you this great respect. We're so honored to have you.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here and very grateful for what you do, for your global reach and your ability to speak the truth, because we seldom hear the truth from the global media, the mainstream media. So much of what they publish, particularly in the area of foreign affairs, there is so little of reality, so little of genuine substance, that it is organizations like yours that give some hope that we can inform the people and perhaps we can move eventually towards a situation of peace. You know, I had a military career, and I fought very fierce battles in Vietnam. I was wounded. My radio men were killed right beside me. As a pilot, my plane came back with bullet holes through the fuselage on 4 different times. But I began to realize the tremendous disconnect between the people who fight, who are gallant, who are just magnificent people, and the people who send them to war. The people who send them to war are playing a game of global chess. They have no interest in the American soldiers and Marines and the other services. They have no interest in the welfare of America. I'm talking as an American. Their interest is in power, wealth, and how they can fit into this global enterprise which promotes war throughout the world. And it does it through very deceptive means. They control the media. The media is very much like a pyramid that starts with the Associated Press and goes down, because many media sources can't have reporters around the world, so they look to the Associated Press. So that becomes truth. And so it has made me a bit of a cynic, because I have spoken to the people, I have spoken to common people, and I've spoken to leaders, and I have watched what's gone on and seen how we have moved to overthrow governments that were no threat to us, to intervene in countries where the people, it's the job of the Venezuelans to sort out. I may not like the Venezuelan government, but it's not my business to decide what sort of government they should have. And the same thing with 100 other countries. And so it's a bit unnerving. As a very, very patriotic American who has shed blood on the battlefield, and I've lain unconscious in the sun of Vietnam for lack of blood, and then you risk your life 100 times, and you discover that the people who make the wars, who orchestrate, who plan the wars, really don't care about you. They don't care about the people who come back in body bags. They don't care about the country. It would be one thing if they sacrificed the troops for the benefit of the nation, that makes some sense. But they're not concerned with the benefit of the nation. They're concerned with some greater global enterprise and where they can fit in and how they personally can gain enormous wealth and power. And this is probably the big lesson that I have learned through many, many years in the Pentagon, in the field of battle, and studying what has gone on, particularly in the Middle East.
After 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. We saw a rise of the neoconservative movement in the United States with Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney at the time, and there's kind of feeling that this was the end of history and liberal progressive democracy had won the battle. To what degree do you see the neocon movement as the beginning of the end for the American hegemony and world power?
The end of the Cold War was such an historic opportunity to achieve peace and a smooth interaction among nations. The Soviet Union dissolved, and all of the countries, including Russia, especially Russia, were desperate to integrate into the community of nations, to regain the respect of the world. I know from interactions that I had with Russia that they really wanted to be more like us. They wanted to be more like the West. They struggled to understand how freedom of the press worked. And they were so absolutist. I spoke with the head of Gazprom, the great oil company, and he said, we're fighting the terrorists in Chechnya, and the terrorists make videos, they're propaganda videos, and we show them on Russian television. I said, what are you doing that for? I said, that's crazy. I said, when we fought the Second World War, we had total censorship. I said, you don't show the enemy's propaganda on your media. This is how naive the Russians were, but they wanted to be free. They wanted to have a free press. And so they did awkward things, sometimes going overboard to achieve this. What an opportunity to bring friendship and love and harmony. But there were people who had tremendous investments of power and money in NATO. NATO had been a fine alliance during the Cold War, excellent. But afterwards, they had no purpose. The Soviets, they gave up their alliance, their military alliance just dissolved. And so we have this massive military alliance. What do? You have to justify a reason for it. And you have to have an enemy. So we made an enemy of Russia. Russia, which was desperate to become a friend of the West. And now, of course, we see NATO expanding around the globe. They no longer are there to defend Europe. They're there to act aggressively to expand the global empire, and people. I have a particular thing because I fought in Vietnam. I was a volunteer, and I was always on the front lines in the most fierce battle. And John Bolton, who's the national security advisor to the president, was a draft dodger in Vietnam. When he was called to fight, he was a coward. He ran. Now he puffs up his chest and he says, we've got to have war here and war there. He's a big warrior. Dick Cheney, who has probably been responsible for the deaths of perhaps millions of people, hundreds of thousands. He was a draft dodger, an admitted, confessed draft dodger. But he beat his chest. He was going to be, respected as the man who has the courage to go to war against countries that, frankly, were not attacking us and were not a threat to us. So there was this very dark, sinister cabal of individuals who began to emerge with Herbert Walker Bush. One of the major things Herbert Walker Bush did, the Republican Party had been the party of peace up until that time. It was the Democrats who took us to war, the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and then all of a sudden, Herbert Walker Bush, who had been the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, not much difference than being the head of the KGB, same type of thing, he flipped it. He said, we now have this three-legged stool where, one of the legs of conservatism is basically war. And then his son carried it on. And the Democrats, which had always been a war organization, except during the Vietnam where some of their base rose up because they were threatened with the draft. Other than that, they've always been the force of war. So now you have the Democrats who favor war and the Republicans who favor war. There is no peace party any longer. And this is a great tragedy. You have all of these neocons, Dick Cheney, you have John Bolton, you have Paul Wolfowitz, you have a great number of people with famous names, and their power, their prestige comes from war. It comes from this feeling that somehow the United States is threatened by enemies from every direction, and we have to build up our military, and there's tremendous money in this, tremendous money in all of this. We have, according to President Trump says we have spent, we have accumulated $7 trillion in national debt. 1/3 of our entire national debt has been incurred in the Middle East. And I cannot tell you a single positive thing that we have achieved in all of these years in the Middle East. We have fought the current set of wars for, 18 years? We have destroyed countries. We have killed probably conservatively 2 million people, starting in Libya, going into Syria, Iraq before that, and Afghanistan before that. We're now killing enormous numbers of Yemenis in a war that is essentially a continuing series of war crimes for the purpose of allowing the Saudi Arabians to put a hated quisling in power, someone who is despised by the people of Yemen, but who will do the bidding of Saudi Arabia. And so we're fighting wars all over the world. Today we have special operations troops in 149 countries. Most countries have American special operations forces. They're involved in varying degrees. In some places, like Niger, I was going to give a speech, and I was going to talk about how we've gotten so out of control. We're fighting everywhere. And I had to pull over off the road and look up on Google and see, what are we fighting in Nigeria or are we fighting in the other place? And okay, we're fighting in the other place. It's called Niger. And then I had to look up, where is Niger? Where is this? Well, it's north of Nigeria. I know that now. But nobody knew we had troops there until there was a patrol that was ambushed, and there were 3 American special operators who were killed. And so I spend a lot of my time studying foreign policy, and I didn't even know the name of the country. And I bet you, if you asked 1,000 Americans, do you remember back a year or so ago when we had a patrol that was attacked and there were 3 soldiers killed? One of them was a black soldier. He was prominent in the news. Some people would say, yeah, I kind of remember that. And then you'd ask, what country was that? And they'd say, I don't know. I don't know. And then you'd say, have you ever heard of Niger? No, I don't think so. Do you know where it is? Do you know what continent it's on? Well, you'd have a lot of people, it kind of sounds like it might be Africa. Some people would just guess. But people don't know where it is. Why are we fighting a war in a country whose name Americans can't even recognize? They don't know where it is on the globe, and yet we're invested there. And this goes on. This is just an example of places all over. The Pentagon admits that we're at war in 7 countries. These are 7 distinct wars that we're fighting simultaneously. Afghanistan, the drone war in Pakistan, Syria. We're still doing some military covert operations in Libya. We're in Yemen heavily. We have bombed Iraq for 28 years. We've dropped 1/3 bombs on a country that never took any hostile action toward the United States. Amazing. It's just amazing what has happened. And we are very quickly bankrupting the country through what we're doing. Our military, it spends as much as the next 10 or 15 largest defense spenders in the world. We spend 10 or 11 times as much as Russia does on our budget. And yet, if you ask the average person on the street who listens to the mainstream media, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. They don't realize Russia has half of our population. Russia has an economy about the size of Italy's. It's a developed, it's a sophisticated nation, but it is not nearly so wealthy as the United States. And yet, they are the justification for NATO. We must tell all of Europe to rearm, to increase their defense spending because of Russia. And yet, if you look at what's happening, we are moving closer and closer and closer and more provocatively towards the Russian border. I was a member of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, and it kind of broke my heart to see that they had been sent to Norway. Because I may be wrong, and correct me because you're the expert, but the last time that foreign troops were stationed permanently in Norway was when Quisling took over and the Nazis had invaded Norway. Now, we didn't invade Norway. We came in at their invitation, so it's all legal and so forth. But why does Norway need to be involved in, neutrality is their strength, and why do they need to be involved in a conflict with Russia. We, if you noted, President Putin is a very bright man, and in addition, he is a very wise man. He's measured in what he does. He's very careful, and he's assisted by Ambassador Lavrov, who has just a wealth of information. He's a tremendous chess player. What you see now is we have become so threatening, and people have actually openly talked about the possibility of nuclear war. And so Russia, which normally would keep secret its advanced weapons, they've disclosed some of what they are, just as a way of telling the United States, don't do this, don't think about nuclear war and destroying all of civilization, because you need to understand that we have developed hypersonic missiles that cannot be intercepted, that can hit American cities. And I think he's even going to publish the targeting list so that people in those cities say, wow, if these crazy people actually push Russia over the brink, then maybe our community goes down. This is a target right here. Loudoun County, Virginia is one of the major targets in a nuclear war. I don't want a nuclear war. I have my grandchildren. I have my children here. I don't want a nuclear war that kills and murders people in Moscow or anywhere in the world. We used to be very cautious about this. During the Cold War, there was such a strict protocol between the Soviets and the United States because people instinctively understood what a nuclear war would amount to. Today, they've forgotten. Generations pass, it's okay, it's, you know. But if it were to break out, it would destroy human civilization. It would destroy the means of feeding people. There would be mass starvation of survivors. There would be riots that would, it would take us back to the Dark Ages. And we need to understand this. And we're abandoning treaties that were entered into with such enormous effort. The efforts that were taken by very heroic people to say, okay, you can never have a treaty that's perfect, but let's have the intermediate nuclear treaty. Let's have non-proliferation treaties so that we draw back and we have more distance. At the very end of the Cold War, we had 1,000 miles of space between East and West. And that meant that when something happened, if something came up on the radar, you had time to pick up the hotline to Moscow or to Washington and say, hey, we've detected something very strange. And the other side could say, here's what's happening. This is what we see on our end, and you know, under no circumstances is this anything designed to threaten you. Now that 1,000 miles has become nothing, zero, and we have troops. We're running naval ships right to the edge of Russian territorial waters. We're taking nuclear capable bombers and we're running towards Russia, and then we turn off at the last instant. And then when the Russians do war exercises to practice defense, we say, oh, this is provocative. It's an outrage. The Russians are running war war exercise. They're running war exercises on their own territory against people who are threatening to invade them. So the situation has taken a very sinister turn. And I think there are people who recognize that our currency and our debt have reached such a level that there may come a time when we must do the most desperate things in the world to maintain our dominance and our control. And it's a very, very dark cloud over human civilization, and it's something that people like you, people like me, we have to be able to inform people and let them know the danger that is faced by the world today.
Before going to the next film, I want to point out two interesting features. And one is that current non-American military analysts, I wanted to point two things out. With considerable respect for Senator Black, he refused to step on the third rail of politics. He listed three neoconservatives, one of whom is Jewish, Richard Pearl. If you look at the list of neoconservative leaders from Richard Pearl, I'm blanking out, there are the community of neoconservatives, insiders, the top group. About 80% of them are Zionist Jews. Some of them are reported, but I cannot document this, to have dual citizenship. And then you have people who are like John Bolton or Dick Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld, who see a great deal of money in being on that inside party. So I am not suggesting that all of the evils fall on or derive from Jews, by no means. But I am saying that the neoconservative movement has grown out of the disillusionment of American Jews with Trotskyism and gone from a form of radical American liberalism to radical American conservatism, for whom, if it is good for Israel, it is intrinsically good for the United States. And Larry Wilkinson said that that's never the case. It is never the case that all issues for one state are the same issues and good for a second state. Even if you're talking about two states that exist side by side. The second issue that I wanted to point out, and that Senator Black implies but does not actually talk about. Currently, one of the most dangerous features about American war planning is groupthink. Non-American military experts listen to and look at what American military planners are saying, and they wonder, where is their sense of reality? When they measure American power, they're measuring, sometimes they're measuring non-existent qualities. In point of fact, three essential elements to being an effective military power are being self-sufficient in those materials that are essential for your existence. Russia is currently, in terms of food and in terms of energy, and possibly with respect to minerals, is self-sufficient. The United States sold to China its last major source of rare earths. The United States imports a substantial amount of oil. It exports basic foodstuffs. So we probably could be self-sufficient in terms of basic foodstuffs, because that's the way the United States has shaped the international market. But I will tell you that Dmitry Orlov, as one example, has said it would be the simplest thing in the world, not only for Russia, but for any serious aggressor, to paralyze the United States. Our electrical grid is such that if you hit it at 4 specific points, not with nuclear weapons, with basically big conventional weapons, the vast majority of the United States would come to a grinding halt. So, non-American military planners and thinkers are suggesting that Americans have, for so long and so effectively, convinced themselves that they are number one, that our leadership now believes it. I once worked for a boss who made the incredible mistake of coming to believe his own propaganda. And it was disastrous for our department and eventually disastrous for our company. So I want you to be aware that groupthink is not merely a problem, but in terms of the United States foreign policy, a very real and imminent danger. Okay, now I'm going to show you.
Who is the woman? She's got an accent. Where is she from?
She's from Norway.
Okay.
And she grew up in some African state, which is why her middle name is Nabintu. I don't know where her financial resources are coming from, but she clearly is well funded and well supported in what she is doing. And she has picked extraordinarily good people to interview. Even when she interviewed Raphael Israeli, everything that Raphael Israeli said was in and of itself accurate. Unfortunately, and this is especially true with respect to Israeli, it was with a tunnel vision. And what Israeli said, what Benjamin or Raphael Israeli said, is that Arab immigration into the West is this major disaster and danger for the West. And he's right. What he doesn't say is that Israeli aggression in the Middle East, as well as American aggression in the Middle East serving Israel's interests, has created this impulse for Arab and Muslim immigration to the West. And the United States, back in the 1960s, basically removed all economic and ethnic restrictions from their immigration policy. Now, there is a tactical reason for that, which we will address in some future program. When you have a polyglot nation, the people of that nation are incapable of coming together as one people in opposition to their government. because you have Southeast Asians and Northeast Asians and Africans and South Americans. You have a group of people with no cultural homogeneity or unity. How is such a people going to rise up and throw off the yoke of oppression? They can't. She has, the Herland report has about 28 published interviews now on YouTube. And I haven't watched a single one that was a dud.
So welcome to the Herland Report, Mr. Phil Giraldi. You are a counterterrorism specialist and a military intelligence officer with the CIA. You used to work with the CIA for many years. Your degrees from the University of Chicago, and you have been working overseas for over 20 years for the United States in the work of terrorism actions. We find your views particularly interesting in explaining what is currently going on geopolitically as well as pertaining to national security in the United States. Look, from the 1990s we've had the development really and the implementation of a globalist kind of economic international system that departs from the nation-based capitalist structure with the strong borders and you know, each nation being a sovereign state. And we see this new type of world order has led to the remarkable rise of an ultra-rich elite. I think Oxfam now states approximately 60 persons, individuals in the world, own more than 50% of world assets. What kind of impact does this have on democracy and our systems?
Well, the simple answer to what you're saying, or what you're asking, is that it basically is completely destructive of a democratic, pluralistic, and nationalistic structure which dominated in the world for most of the 20th century. Globalism basically means that the old benchmarks for what constituted threats and national interests have more or less disappeared, and there are new threats and interests that have been contrived by the globalists. And this has meant in practice that globalism, as it is exercised by the people who are the elites or the establishment in many countries, have transferred wealth to themselves, transferred political power to themselves, and have essentially made it that they are the ones dictating what are the interests of the various countries and what has to be done to support their own interests.
And it's peculiar too, because when you look at that transnational, international business model, when you're outsourcing jobs to China, for example, or India, there is no redistribution of wealth back to the country from which the jobs were taken, which is the situation for the US today.
Yeah, that's right. There's always been this myth, it's always been a myth, that there is a trickle down in economics, where when people at the top of the system make a lot of money, it all comes down to the people, eventually to the people below, and the people below get a share of that. Now that worked when you had nations or you had closed communities that had industries that were local, because the money stayed locally. And now the difference is that the money goes outside the system, and the people who lose their jobs forever. And so there's no trickle down. This was, I think Ronald Reagan was the one who actually coined the expression trickle down economics. And so we don't see that happening anymore, because the money is fungible, and it moves offshore, it moves to other places, and it is used to further the interest of the of the elites, of the establishment, in terms of what their own interests rather than the interests of the people in the country.
As well, we saw when Donald Trump initially took office, one of the elements he spoke about was that he wanted to stop the tax havens, because one of the elements within this kind of globalist structure and the borderlessness that it's depending on, borderless societies, is that then where are you going to pay tax? So you end up establishing yourself in a way that you don't pay taxes anywhere.
Yeah, well, as we've just seen recently, the richest man in the world paid no taxes last year on income of $10 billion. Mr. Bezos, who owns the Washington Post and Amazon. So this was a myth that Donald Trump was describing. He saw the loss of jobs, the loss of economic viability in the communities in the United States as a problem with jobs being exported to Mexico or exported to China or exported to Vietnam. But that's not really the problem. The problem is that the whole global economic system is now no longer national. It's not a question of people getting jobs. It's a question of basically how the people at the top of the system manipulate the economy to benefit themselves. And it's if Donald Trump cuts a deal with Mexico, that's meaningless, because the people who are able to control the economic factors will go somewhere else. And when they go somewhere else, they will then go somewhere else after that. So it's a poor understanding by Donald Trump, who styles himself as a businessman, of how exactly the markets work today.
Pertaining to globalists, one may say, such as George Soros, I know you've been doing some work on him as well, because it's remarkable to see that when you study the George Soros Foundation and the initial speeches you find on his webpage, these are wonderful statements of the belief in democracy and the sharing of the wealth with everybody.
Yeah, George Soros is a particular example. He may have been one of the first of the real globalists who saw that economics did not live separate from politics. And so George sets up foundations, he sets up institutes, and these institutes actually interfere with democracy in the countries they get involved in. And we're seeing that, we have seen it recently with the case of Ukraine. We see a lot of activity by George Soros in Eastern Europe. And essentially, he is interested in interfering in the politics because he knows that when you get rid of the forces of democracy of the people, you can manipulate the elites, because the elites are only interested in money. So George Soros is constantly seeking to promote what he calls democracy, but it's a democracy, it's more like an oligarchy. And the oligarchs all know each other. And the oligarchs all have a common interest, which is essentially the 50, 60 people you were talking about, to continue their domination of the global economy. It's not a national economy anymore, it's a global economy.
Let's get into Ukraine. What was George Soros' role in Ukraine? We all remember the Maidan, that later turned out to be fire shots from other angles than what was initially reported. And
Well, George Soros, as I indicated before, essentially was involved in setting up foundations and groups that were unfriendly to the existing government, which in turn was friendly to Russia and was creating problems for Soros and his other establishment people, because they wanted to have access to government in a way that they could manipulate it. And by getting rid of the government, which had been democratically elected, they were able to bring in a government that they have considerable control over. And I would add the United States State Department played a big role in this too, because governments in some places, United States and Britain would be two prime examples, have very much become globalist in terms of how the elites in the government respond. Bill Clinton was a globalist when he was president of the United States, essentially, and cashed in after he ceased being president. And his wife continued to work as a globalist when she was Secretary of State. So we have that. Tony Blair. These are people that all have been co-opted by the system that George Soros and others have set up.
Speaking about Hillary Clinton, it's such a paradox that you introduce into the American system through the rise of the Clinton Foundation, some sort of pay for play, which was an element that was prohibited by law, I do believe, in the United States before, in order to stop the corruption in the government and in Congress.
Yeah. Well, it was clever the way the Clintons played that. The revolving door, they call it in Washington, where people leave the government and then take a job with a private company that is involved in the same business that they had when they were in government, is prohibited for a number of years, 5 years in many cases. But if you don't go to something that's similar, you're free. You're free to go make a speech and someone will pay you whatever they think it's worth. Bill Clinton made speeches for $250,000, $500,000, I believe in one case $750,000, $750,000. So he was not necessarily promoting the interests of a company or a corporation. He was going and making a speech. So he abided by the rules, but he manipulated what the rules were. And meanwhile, his wife, of course, claimed that she had nothing to do with the foundation because she was still in the government, and yet she maintained as a separate email account which mixed government business, foundation business, and personal business all together. And she's never been held accountable for any of this.
How come?
Well, because the United States government is corrupt is the simple answer. Everyone is in it for the money. Not everyone. There are 5 or 6 exceptions in the government among Congress and the White House, but most of them are ultimately believe that they are entitled. These are entitled people in government. And probably every country is a little bit like that. But in the United States, it's a lot like that. And as soon as these people leave the government, they figure out ways to cash in, to make their government time profitable for their retirement or however they choose to define it.
If you want to run for Congress, you can be entirely funded by various corporations or lobby groups, big pharma, oil and gas, whatever. Then when you are elected, there's no restriction on you amending bills or participating in changing the structure in such a way that it would profit precisely the groups that funded you to enter Congress in the first place. And thirdly, you are also, as a congressman or congresswoman, there's no problem in you owning stocks or amending bills with having the potential to have those stocks soar, being funded by precisely the same corporations that you are amending, and potentially for you to then earn a lot of money from the rising of those stocks. Is this a correct perception?
It is an absolutely correct perception, except your first step is too nice. It is essential for someone running for Congress to have that kind of support. So it's not an option. It's something that they have to have. And so they go and look for the people who have the money, who then make the rest of the process work, where they buy the congressman right in the beginning, and from that point on, the congressman is owned. And this is an unfortunate aspect of American democracy, if you want to call it that. The fact is, you need money to run for Congress. And to get the money, you have to go to someone who has the money. And someone who has the money has an interest in letting you have some of his money. So that's how it works.
So to what degree is the American system really a democratic system, if that is how it works?
I think the simple answer is that the American system is no longer a democracy. It's a controlled democracy. And the democracy is basically controlled. Well, people refer to the deep state or the establishment. And those are convenient expressions. That means where the money is, where the power is, and where the government goes to get its directions and how it's told what it should do.
Again, returning to the question of a pay for play, because Judicial Watch, of course, came out in 2015, I do believe it was, with the report showing that the Clinton Foundation received large sums from foreign states.
Right.
And this, of course, spills into the prop of national security and homeland security for the United States as well. My particular interest is that the three main states that paid into the Clinton Foundation was Norway, the Qatar of Europe, the oil-rich Qatar of Europe from which we come from. Then was the Saudi Arabia, understandably enough, the leading ally to the United States. And the third state was Qatar. How do you explain Norway's role into this?
I've always been intrigued by Norway's role in bankrolling the Clintons. There probably is a connection. I have never seen it explained in very clear terms. The connection with Saudi Arabia and Qatar is very clear. The United States provides all kinds of benefits to the Saudis, Qataris, and Israelis in that region, and it's a quid pro quo.
It's interesting to see such a small state of only 6 million people being so involved in these kinds of power plays, and also to note that such an unproportionate high degree of Norwegian officials then are being appointed into the central positions in the UN-based and American-dominated structures such as NATO and you know, I mean, it's
World
just
Bank, perhaps.
Yes, it's and WHO, a number of these organizations, and of course, just in attempting to look at how the de-democratization process is being done in the Western nations. We recently had one of our prime ministers, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was prime minister in Norway for a number of years, maybe our first globalist prime minister, after she headed on to leading the WHO and has done that for a number of years and leading positions within that system. And she's an older woman now, and she came back to Norway recently, and she stated bluntly up front, in front of the leading media, saying that we are so sad that we are beginning to lose our control over what the public is being told. And this sentence was all over the media, many of them maybe
Wow.
not realizing what a blunt mistake that was of her to put it out so honestly.
Brutal. Well, I think that you have your answer there. I think there is obviously a quid pro quo in terms of the elite in your own country talking to the elite in the United States and Britain, and essentially coming to understandings which maybe are not written down on paper, and are just, as the Italians would say, a quattro occhi, just between us. And so the elite people, the establishment people, they talk in a different language. They understand each other. They don't even have to say anything because their interests are global. Their interests are in terms of maintaining their status and to maintain the system that supports them. So that is why things work the way they work. In the United States now, for example, Donald Trump, when he was running for president, promised to end the wars in the Middle East. Now we've seen that when he tries to do it, there are problems with that. This is because the establishment is very powerful. It has It has its people in the Pentagon, in the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, in the justice system, in Congress, both parties. And these people all understand. They understand the language. They understand what they're saying to each other, even without saying it. And this is the way they work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Phil Giraldi, for taking the time to joining us here at the Herland Report in discussing these various matters that are so important to the development in the West.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I wanted to add Mr. Giraldi's interview precisely because Phil understands the way the decision makers work. Senator Black understands the level at which the decisions he thinks he is making are made. And even Mr. Black, or Senator Black, avoided touching the third rail of Israel. So he may be somewhat naive about the upper level of the elite ruling class, but he still understands the power politics of being reelected. And if you say something negative about Israel, you have destroyed your political career in the United States. Thank you very much.